Thank you so much. And what a treat to be here. I feel like I'm the second art historian interloper in this more medical conference. Excuse me, but I think my granddad graduated from medicine here in 1939, so I'll use that as a coattail to ride in on. Um, what an act to follow. Claire has really laid the foundation for, I suppose, this world into which actually Dr. James Barry was born, kind of probably aware of a famous uncle in London, and with the whispers around town of how he was doing and the successes he was having, and probably some begrudgery in there as well. But it's so interesting to think of the legacy of the painter James Barry, also in terms of, he actually transformed the idea of art in Cork. So, although he was born in a city that wasn't known for painting, it became known for painting because of him. And he is the foundation stone, I think, that many generations of artists have built on. Really, what a fabulous presentation. So my focus will be that other James Barry as well. But really, what my talk uh, addresses is a sort of a bridge between generations, a bridge between the painter James Barry and the doctor James Barry, and what that bridge is made of. And it is really an unlikely gift from an uncle to someone he didn't really know, and yet the impact is hugely significant. So here are our two James Barrys, allegedly. And so we have James Barry, the uncle, and James Barry, the doctor. And this tale of two James Barrys really allows us to focus in on almost a Dickensian approach to inheritance. If you've ever read or seen an adaptation of Bleak House by Charles Dickens, um, the dependency on an inheritance or the expectation of inheriting something can really undermine someone's life. But what's remarkable here is how an inheritance enables a life, enables a career to be fully expressed. And I suppose that is the life and career we're celebrating as part of this conference. So I'll begin in Cork, but I will go to London as well, so another city. Um, I begin on the quays of Cork. And Claire has already mentioned a little bit about the city of the 18th century and how it was thought of. But of course, it was a vibrant maritime city, and I suppose didn't necessarily trade on culture or any cultural heft, but it did in terms of victualling and what would become the British Navy. And so there was a lot of, I suppose, money to be made in this city. It was said that in the early 19th century, you could move to Cork and within 10 years make your fortune. And so many of the kind of wealthy families of Cork, like the Crawfords of Crawford Art Gallery fame, and the Beamishes and so on, they moved to Cork in the late 18th century, and by the 1820s, they were I suppose, the great and the good. And so it's interesting to think of that and how Dr. James Barry was growing up in that city. You'll hear more about Dr. James Barry's life tomorrow morning on Tom Spalding's walking tour, and of course the 11 a.m. session as well. But here we are in the Quays of Cork. I think this is from 1819, so it's just a number of years after I suppose, the dates we're looking at in terms of Dr. James Barry's life in the city. But this is, I suppose, the neighbourhood in which Dr. James Barry grew up. And I'm going to keep saying Dr. James Barry just to not confuse you with painter James Barry. And Dr. James Barry grew up with in the household of Mary Ann Bulkley, who was James Barry's sister. What's interesting here is the bustle, the potential that this scene affords us. This is probably Patrick's Quay, looking from a vantage point of kind of where Patrick's Bridge is today. So Merchant's Quay would be along the boated side of the image here. And Merchant's Quay is, I suppose, where Dr. James Barry grew up, as did my grandfather. Um, Epicenter of all things. And the potential that this affords because of the contact with the world. You were on the edge of the world here because you could touch the rest of the world through these ships. And it must have been tremendously exciting to be part of that or to be near it. Um, Having said that, the news of the painter James Barrie's death on the 22nd of February, 1806, didn't reach Cork, or certainly didn't reach the ears of his family back in Cork for several months. And so by the time Mary Ann Buckley hears of her brother's death, it has been several months, and her brother Redmond has already been going after the inheritance in London. Uh, Mary Ann had already tried her luck with her then living brother in London to support her as her own marriage broke down and her eldest son became uh, someone who you wouldn't really care for, let's put it that way. And so all her hopes were on the young, soon to be Dr. James Barry. Um, so let's just keep that in mind. This is the sort of setting that kicks things off. And news of the uncle's death has reached Cork, and Mary Ann takes the young James Barry with her to London to pursue this inheritance. And it is an unlikely gift because, for all the world, James Barry the painter was destitute. He was living in squalor on Castle Street in London. This is a rendering of his house at the time of his death. The windows are smashed, the door is a little bit subsided or damaged. And the windows have been smashed, presumably by local children who have been bullying him, mocking him for being an eccentric, for being an odd character. And he seemingly patched these windows up with unsold prints from his body of work. And yet, as Claire has charted, he had an extraordinary career, an unlikely one in itself. But that extraordinary career scaled the heights of the art world in London. And so what he had in his house was a whole stock, if you will, a studio full of paintings, drawings, prints, a library full of books, plaster casts that he would draw from. And this was all in ostensibly a home of someone who happened to be in, people were raising subscriptions to support him. And yet, after his death, it was found that, or actually before he died, it was found that he had £40 on his person, which he then started looking for when people took it away from him for safekeeping. And after his death, which it was determined that he had several investments in government stocks in the Americas and in Britain. So he was quite a wealthy man, and it just wasn't liquid. So he had investments and he had assets. And this is, I suppose, what Mary Ann Bulkley was interested in as a legacy for herself, but particularly to send her or to really set up her youngest child for a successful life. And so she had the support of many of James Barry, the painter's circle of friends and supporters in London, including Edward Fryer, a physician who had come from lowly beginnings in Wiltshire and had established himself as a doctor in London and had been a great friend of James Barry. And so Edward Fryer had taken many of the paintings owned by James Barry and left in the house, and had taken them to Christie's for safekeeping, but also to a number of other households in London for safekeeping until such time as they knew what to do with them. Um, Impatient as ever, Marianne bought her brother Redmond out of his inheritance for £300. A gamble, apparently, according to the biographers of Dr. James Barry. A gamble that paid off somewhat, and an auction was held at Christie's, which is still going strong today. So it has currency now as much as it did then. But Christie's auctioned the whole estate, essentially, of James Barry, the painter, and the revenue from that, minus fees and minus legal bills, would go to Marianne and the young James Barry. And so here's just an image by Thomas Rowlinson of the interior of the auction rooms of Christie's, maybe a couple of years afterwards, 1808, 1810. But it would be floor to ceiling, salon hung paintings. And you can imagine it being a hive of activity. It was naturally lit from above as well. And so it was, I suppose, a very modern room for its time. But this is, I suppose, another image or sense of the atmosphere that was gathering around this potential inheritance and what would become of it. And I'm getting to my point. So, um, sorry, it's a little bit of a story, an anecdote, extended anecdote. And so, the 10th and 11th of April, 1807, at Christie's, here is the cover of the auction catalogue, which says that it picks out Pandora receiving, what is it? Her presents from the gods, which was ostensibly James Barry's magnum opus, which hadn't been shown. And this was the big hope that it would make a fortune. And then various other works, including the Venus and Diamini. Is that how you say it? I don't know why I'm looking at Claire just for moral support. And then I suppose his drawings, his prints, his series of prints, including of the great cycle of the progress of human culture, from his Royal Society murals cycle, and then his casts and his library. So that's all being auctioned across 2 days. Like you can imagine, you can picture the scenes that you've seen on the news of Sotheby's and Christie's today, and maybe none of them were shredding through a fax machine, or there were bananas stuck to the wall, but this was the atmosphere. And what's wonderful is that we still have access to this catalogue, but also the one that annotated with who bought what and how much did they spend. And so I'm pointing my little arrow, you'll have to trust me on this, it's a bit small, but lot number 110 is the painting I'm about to show you. And it was bought by Penrose for £25 or £26 and 5 shillings, which today it's hard to adjust for inflation. There are inflation calculators, but there are many different variables at work and what type of thing you're adjusting. But it could be anywhere from about €2,500 in today's money to adding on a zero to that. So that's the kind of leeway you have to allow for these inflation calculators. So Penrose bought this painting and a number of other works at this auction. And the painting, lot number 110, is the Prince of Wales in the guise or character of St. George. It's been part of Crawford Art Gallery's collection since 1930, but it indeed was purchased by Cooper Penrose of Cork. And it's remarkable that this painting had been painted in London by a Cork-born artist and had found its way back to this city and still remains in this city. although technically it's currently in storage. But it will be back on display any year now. Um, but I want to call attention to this painting because I think it allows us into that world and into that story of the inheritance that one James Barry essentially leaves the other and what that means. It also has a very interesting subject matter in that it's presenting a named figure, the Prince of Wales, who has assumed another identity, in this case, St. George. It's a really edifying painting and a very flattering portrait of the man who will become the Prince Regent and later King George IV, notoriously Britain's worst monarch, who had to have an act of parliament passed to clear his gambling debts. Um, and um, and so here he is being shown in all of the glory and saintliness of George, the Slayer of Dragons. It's an interesting pitch by James Barry, the artist, to curry favour with the monarchy in the year of the French Revolution, at a time when his own career was starting to slide towards not necessarily oblivion, but certainly from the heights that he had reached. It is an extraordinary painting, which I'll revisit shortly. But who bought it? This man, Cooper Penrose of Cork, he was a Quaker merchant prince, you might say. He lived on Lover's Walk at a house called Wood Hill with his wife Elizabeth Dennis. She was the money. Between them, they had an extraordinary life. Um, uh, Cooper's son, William Edward Penrose, had essentially given a character reference for Mary Ann Bulkeley as she left Cork for London to claim her inheritance. He swore before the Mayor of Cork that this indeed was Mary Ann Bulkeley, and she really was the sister of James Barry. And this was proof, as much as you could, in those days, that she was who she said she was, and she had a claim. So that was Cooper's son vouching for Mary Ann Bulkeley. And Cooper Penrose, after this auction, having also bought works from it, um, was one of the administrators of the investment trust of those proceeds for Mary Ann Bulkeley. And so the Penrose family weren't just philanthropists hoovering up from a studio sale, they were also very much linked with supporting Mary Ann and the young James Barry in this moment, because as women, Mary Ann as a woman couldn't inherit in the same way, or couldn't have money in the same way as perhaps her brothers would, and she was the heir. But what's interesting here is Cooper is also one of those wonderful figures who brings all sorts of black sheep into his home, including Lord Edmund Fitzgerald and Robert Emmet and Sarah Curran. So all of these people who are connected with rebellion in Ireland. And so the home of Wood Hill, which isn't actually in this painting, but I'm just setting the scene a little bit. This is the River Lee by Nathaniel Grogan, who Claire mentioned earlier was also taught by John Butts, who had been, I suppose, that first master of James Barry. And here we have the River Lee, and we're looking upriver to the city. And we have the lovely hill of Tivoli and Montenotte beyond. And the big houses that were built along that hill or bridge were built by the wealthy families and the merchant princes, not only to get out of the cholera-infested streets of Cork city centre. There was a cholera outbreak in 1832 and other years, but also because they could watch their ships coming in and out of harbour. So and they had ready access to the river at a time when, I suppose, roads were less plentiful. I like to think that the boat in the middle of the river is Gossamer, which was owned by the Penroses. it had something like 12 cannons on board. I think little small clay cannons, not full-size cannons. And they were members of the Royal Cork Yacht Club, or the Water Club of Cork, as it was then. And so they're kind of terrorizing the river for leisure. And it's because of things like this that they fall foul of their own community in Cork. I'll come back to Dr. James Barry shortly. But this is the family supporting Marianne and the young James Barry in London. This is Wood Hill, their home in Tivoli. Um, if any of you kind of know the Lower Glanmire Road, where there's a skew bridge over the railway, that's where Wood Hill was, just in the trees there. And it was a very fine home, neoclassical, with pavilions added to it to house their art collection. They had a room dedicated to print, including the prints of James Barry, and works by Angelica Kauffman, and James Barry, and Jacques-Louis David, and others. So it was a really extraordinary collection, which, with no sense of hyperbole, someone termed or named it the Vatican of Ireland. Just on the shores of the River Lee. But in that auction, Venus Rising from the Sea was purchased by Cooper Penrose as well. And so for this naughty picture, and the owning a yacht with cannons, and really just being very flamboyant with their wealth, they were read out of their Quaker community for being immodest. And yet they continued to be very neighbourly people and to look after those who were less well off. And so we come back to this painting. It resided in Wood Hill until 1930, when out of its frame and propped against a wall, in a sort of, by then, kind of mouldering Wood Hill, past its heyday, it was purchased by Crawford Art Gallery. And it, for many years, hung on the grand staircase of the gallery. And I suppose its story has never really been told other than through the lens of the painter himself. But what of this unlikely gift? I said that it shows the Prince of Wales in the guise of St. George, so assuming another identity. Claire has already mentioned how James Barry had become friends, had developed a relationship and friendship with Edmund Burke, the great philosopher and statesman. And here is the double portrait of James Barry and Edmund Burke. Again, not as themselves, because for James Barry, you needed to elevate portraiture. Portraiture for him was the lowest rank of art. And that's why, although he's buried next to Joshua Reynolds in St. Paul's Cathedral in London, he despised Joshua Reynolds for wasting his talent as a portrait artist when he could have been a history painter. And so here is James Barry saying, this is how you do portraiture. You create a likeness and then you give them a different life. In this case, they are Ulysses or Odysseus, which is very topical. The Odyssey movie is out this summer. But they are fleeing the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus. And it is an extraordinary attempt at aggrandizing a portrait through allegory. And so it is both a history painting, it's referring to mythology, and it's referring to literature and the classics, but it's also presenting Edmund Burke and James Barry within this narrative of obstacle-laden lives, and that you have to get over these obstacles and through these obstacles to achieve Ithaca and to achieve your end goal. And and so I hope I'm not laying on too thick, but with this idea of taking identity and using my little serenading telling me to wrap up, I think. But taking an identity and kind of spinning it through allegory is what James Barry, the painter, often did well. But what I want to, I suppose, propose that through the sale of a painting like this, um, it created a legacy for the future Dr. James Barry to not assume the identity that they would present for the rest of their life, but also that it wouldn't be allegory, it would be actual and it would be essential. And so the sale of these works in 1807 generated a legacy that was anywhere between, depending again on the inflation calculator, anywhere between, let's say, €150,000 today and 2.5 million. And so this is the legacy that's just a little snap of Dr. James Barry with John, his servant, and Psyche, his dog, that you'll probably see again. But this is the legacy that the painter James Barry left to our doctor, and the legacy of possibility. And what I think is wonderful, it isn't just the money, it was the connections. It was Dr. Edward Fryer and it was General Miranda and others who rallied around this young person with the potential to do wonders. Um, and and they made it happen together. But it's that network and gift of the funds to do so and the means to do so that set Dr. James Barry on his way. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.